Welcome to our final session of On the Same Page, Creating a Life You Love. I hope you've had a great couple of weeks. After our last session, I sent you an application assignment, and I'd love to know how things went, if anything went well for you, if there was anything challenging. One participant mentioned that she was better able to recognize when she was emotionally flooded. She'd take a break from the conflict, but she'd catch herself stewing over the problem. In the past 2 weeks, she's gotten faster at catching herself at the stewing stage and try to get her mind off of the problem. Are there any other comments or things that you've noticed in the last 2 weeks since we had our last session or our first session?
I think I've noticed bids for attention a lot more and just been more conscious of things like patting my husband on the back or like being more physically sitting next to him when we watch TV rather than in a different couch, and just little things like that were really good for connection. And also, I feel like I've been more vulnerable sharing things that worry me with him that I've just tended not to share. And it's been really great. I think we feel better connected.
I love that. And do you feel like it's mostly been subtle changes, little changes?
Yeah. But I think they're subtle, but it's like a little adjustment does big things.
Yeah.
So thank you. I love learning from you.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you've been able to see some growth and changes in the last couple of weeks. So our first session last week had the subtitle of Building an Emotionally Close Environment. And what we learned there about bids for connection, the rituals of connection, and tools for communication is an important foundation for what we're going to be focusing on tonight, which is about building a partnered relationship, especially regarding mental load. Excuse me.
I'm excited about that.
Oh, good. By the end of the session, the goal is for you to be able to comfortably explain mental load and the 3 steps of task completion, identify some pain points of your unique mental load, apply fair play principles to discuss the mental load with your partner, and have a plan on how to incorporate weekly check-ins where conversations like these can occur. So now I want to take you back nearly a decade to when my husband Matthew and I were newlyweds. Matthew made a year in review video where we reflected on parts of our marriage and we talked about what it was like to be married. And this was my response. I said that being married is like having your best friend with you all the time. And then this was Matthew's response. He said, it's just a partnership. And I teased him over the years because even him saying it was kind of emotionless. But recently I realized that a partnership is exactly what I want for my marriage. So what do you think of when you hear the term partnered relationship? How would you define that?
To me, that sounds like you're really working together, like headed the same direction.
I agree. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes diving more into that definition of a partnered relationship. And we'll start with ChatGPT and what it had to say about it. So I asked what the meaning was of the word partnership. And it said it refers to a relationship between 2 or more people that work together towards a common goal. This collaboration typically includes sharing responsibilities, resources, and benefits. The key elements of a partnership often include mutual trust, shared decision-making, and a commitment to achieving the agreed-upon objectives. And I think ChatGPT nailed it. I love that it highlighted that partners share responsibilities. Dr. Julie Higgs put into words something important about those shared responsibilities. She said, it's not about dividing up tasks 50-50. That's what people often misunderstand about partnership. It's not who does what, it's who decides who does what. So I found this to be true in the research my classmates and I did in the spring of 2024. When participants reported that they agreed on the assignment of the chores, they often also reported higher relationship satisfaction. Their satisfaction wasn't dependent on having an equal split in the work, but in having chosen the work that they were doing. Now, while this isn't the case for every couple, many of our daily tasks fall into a culturally stereotypical male or female division. And when I was looking for images for this slide, it was almost comical to me how stereotypical it was. When I looked up yard work, working, and home repair, almost every image was a man. And when I looked up cleaning, cooking, and childcare, women were who were portrayed doing those tasks. So we definitely have a cultural bias when it comes to what we do day to day. Although I want to mention that dividing the work into those more traditional roles isn't necessarily a bad thing. It only tends to be a problem when roles are taken on because it's assumed that that's what each partner is going to do, rather than having made that decision together. So Eve Rodsky, who I'll introduce more in the next slide, claims that the only way to end that cultural bias is to move from assumption to structured decision-making. Most of our time together tonight is going to be learning how to make more of that structured decision when it comes to the tasks associated with mental load. So I'll give you a quick background on Havertz, whose work we're going to be focusing on tonight. Her background is in law, where she worked in organizational management and family mediation. Like many women, she was juggling many responsibilities at home and at work. After the birth of her second kid, she realized that she hit a breaking point. She was being denied bigger projects at work and was told that they were not going to make any accommodations for her to breast pump while at work. She was given the option to go into a closet with no outlet to use some sort of pump, a battery operated pump. They weren't going to make anything easy for her to do that. And then on her way home from work, she got a text from her husband that said, "I'm surprised you forgot to buy blueberries for my smoothie." She says that was a moment, that was the huge turning point, feeling frustrated with not being supported at work, feeling like there was an unequal distribution of domestic labor in her own life, and feeling the burden of so much work even in her own home. So this led her to spend nearly a decade conducting research to help her make the invisible load more visible, which culminated in her book, Fair Play, a game-changing solution for when you have too much to do and more life to live. And it's a system for couples to create a more balanced and fulfilling life. And I'll be sharing a few of her principles tonight. So I want to echo her when she says, "I want to start treating our homes like our most important organizations." With her background in organizational management, she was able to see that a lot of the things that we're doing in our homes follow a system within professional organizations, and that they have boundaries, systems, and communication. And when we establish those in our own homes, we have a much more fulfilling partnership. So I've noticed the term mental load has been kind of a hot topic recently, and there are a lot of other terms that are maybe synonymous, like cognitive load, invisible labor, the second shift. And she defines the mental load as the invisible cognitive work involved in managing a household and family. This includes tasks like planning, organizing, anticipating needs, and remembering responsibilities that often are unnoticed or unacknowledged. It also involves the continuous mental effort required to keep track of what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, how it should be done. And these tasks can often lead to significant stress and burnout, especially for women who often bear the brunt of the burden in the household. So I'd like for you to take a second. I think I'll set a 60-second timer and have you write down things that you would put onto your own mental load list. I'll set a timer. 1 minute, not 1 hour. There we go. All right, so next we're going to go over the 3 steps of task management. So Eve Rodsky had seen how in the corporate world, when something was needed to be done, it was easily broken down into 3 steps. And she was able to see this in our household tasks. And an example that she often gives is she poses the question, how does mustard get to your house? And it begins with conception or noticing. My kid only eats their protein if it's doused in mustard. She also notices that it's running low. The next step is planning. She puts mustard on the shopping list. Finally is the step of execution. Maybe she has a grocery pickup, or this is when her partner comes in. Maybe he takes the list to the store, but grabs spicy Dijon mustard instead of the kid preferred yellow mustard. And she gets frustrated. How did he not know what their kids like? If she can't trust him with a grocery run, how could she trust him with bigger issues in the home? And the final step of execution is often where our partners come in when they are trying to help. How many times have you heard, just tell me what to do and I'll help? While it's wonderful they want to help, what isn't being seen is that 2/3 of the task still falls on you. Even when you make a list of things for your partner to do, you are in charge of conception and planning, and that can be incredibly draining. Now we'll go through another example of the mental load with a load of laundry, pun intended. So with conception, we have some way of becoming aware that laundry needs to be done. Maybe we have a day we do it, we see an overflowing basket, or we have run out of underwear. Next, we'll make a plan. Do we have laundry detergent? Do we have access to a washer and dryer? Do we need to get to a laundromat? When are we going to be there long enough to switch and start and switch a load so it doesn't get mildewy? And then finally, the execution. We wash, dry, and maybe even put it away. Maybe your partner or you comes and folds the laundry. But can you see how that isn't even the full picture of laundry? Learning the 3 steps, which Havertz refers to as CPE, was really mind-blowing to me. And it helped me see why sometimes I was burnt out. There's a lot more to task completion than what usually gets recognized or helped with. Emphasis is usually given to that execution, but execution isn't possible without first the conception and the planning. So look again at your list and pick one of your mental load tasks and see if you could break it down into the 3 steps. I'll move that so you can see it again. The conception, planning, and execution. If you want to tell me when you've done that, or if you need help breaking it down, just let me know.
I think I've got it. One of the things on my mental load list is people. And I've noticed that my husband will say, oh, it would be so fun to do this with these kids or grandkids, or we should invite somebody over to do that, to do this. And I sometimes am frustrated because it's like he's either working and getting paid to work, or he's having fun. Mm-hmm. And when he says, let's do this, I have to stop and think, well, I'm right in the middle of this, and this is already committed to, and I feel like such a wet blanket because he just wants to do it. But on my list are people that I worry about, and like, am I staying in touch with them enough, whether it's a neighbor or a relative or the kids, the grandkids. And so maybe an open discussion with him when he says something would be fun to go do, then I could say, well, I'm actually worried about if we're connected with these ones, what if we did it with these ones? Mm-hmm. And then he can help plan doing it. Yeah. So I guess I have the conception is still mine because I'm the one that has a worry, but maybe I could talk to him about considering all 6 and what their needs are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That kind of discussion.
Yeah, I think it is hard because there are so many, maybe you have 3 that you're more comfortable with and 3 that he's more comfortable with, and he takes that conception, planning, and execution with 3 and you do it with 3. But again, that's hard to split 50-50, especially if he does the execution and not so much the planning.
Right. And if I just say, we need to do something with this family, what do you think would be fun to do? Then I can say what my thought is, but then he'd be more involved in the conception, planning, and execution.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good thought. I like that. Yeah, I think one of the things that I wrote down was our oldest daughter has really thick hair. And so I've been noticing that she gets it tangled all the time, or food gets into it. And so I was like, okay, I need to treat her hair like a daily thing. Like usually we'd brush her hair in the morning, but I'm realizing it needs it more often. And so I've started doing it at night as well. So I've noticed the problem. I've planned at night after she gets in her pajamas, I brush her hair and talk to her, and we're doing it. But that is something that is sometimes, I think sometimes the conception can be really hard because maybe we're noticing more.
I think you've hit on something there. I think because we feel like it's in our realm of responsibilities, or just maybe we're more aware. Because I know years ago when we only had a couple kids, I would call my husband at work after I did something, say cleaned out a closet, and say, when you come home, look in the closet and be amazed. And he would. And even though I had to tell him to do it, and then he was happy to do it, it gave me that satisfaction of I'm not the only one noticing. Yeah. I don't know how we help each each other notice more, except, I guess, bringing it up.
Yeah, and Havertz actually created a game that helps you to do that, to see
Oh,
what each other's doing. So
games are
we're
good.
talking about that, yes. So the topic of mental load can be hard, and not even just hard, but multifaceted, like you and I have just talked about. There's so many layers to what's getting done. And this isn't meant to bash any partner at all. And Dr. Daniel Siegel said, we name it to tame it. So the goal is for us to have the words and principles that we can better share and have these conversations. And Eve Rodsky asserts that this is done by having boundaries, systems, and I think most especially that communication. Establishing boundaries means setting clear limits and expectations on household roles and tasks, and ensures that neither partner feels overwhelmed and that their personal time is respected. Implementing structured approaches to divide and complete domestic responsibilities reduces the mental load. And open and regular discussions help partners understand each other's needs, negotiate responsibilities, and make changes as life morphs and needs change. Okay, we're gonna take a quick break, and then we'll talk more about how Eve Rodsky suggests setting those boundaries, and then also talk about how weekly check-ins help with that communication element about the mental load. So I'll see you in just a moment. All right, if you want to turn your screen back on, or just let me know when you are ready. You're ready.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, so we've been talking about Eve Rodsky and the management of our mental load. And as I mentioned earlier, discussing the mental load can feel kind of challenging or complicated, and a lot of things to talk about. And when I started researching this in the spring, it led to a lot of really good conversations with people. They started sharing that seeing all that goes on into the tasks, the conception, planning, and execution helps them feel a little bit more validated in how exhausting managing family life, not to mention work and maintaining other relationships, can be. Many also noted how they were noticing how common it was for their partner to jump in right at the execution stage. And I experienced this firsthand in my own relationship with my husband. We have a running list of projects that we do around the house. There are things like organize the shed, clean the leaves out by the air conditioner, spray for bugs, etc. And Kevin is a teenager in our neighborhood who sometimes comes over and helps with these tasks. I hadn't had him over for a while, and Matthew was wondering why. At the time, we had to touch up the paint on the outdoor lamp on our list. My husband said something along the lines of, that would be easy for Kevin to do. You should have him do that. With the mental load on my mind, I responded, actually, that's still a lot of work for me, and I don't have the bandwidth for that. It isn't as easy as just having him come and paint. I see it on the list, and I think, do we need to have it cleaned first? Do I have the right paint? Do I have our painter's tape? When can he come over? Because he's on spring break, and so our schedules are kind of weird. And that one conversation helped him, my husband Matthew, see that a to-do list doesn't always reflect all that goes into the task. And it has led to a lot of really good conversations about mental load. So soon after the blueberry incident, where Eve Rodsky's husband mentioned he was surprised she'd forgotten his blueberries, she tried to do something to make that invisible work more visible. With women across the country, she cataloged every single action they took in service of their family that had a quantifiable time component. And when she sent her husband the spreadsheet of all the things that women were doing, his response was this. He didn't want to see it. He felt like it was a bit of an attack. So while the spreadsheet illuminated how much invisible work was being done, it seemed to provoke more rage and scorekeeping than change. And we don't want to approach our partner with criticism or anger. Remember, criticism and contempt often lead to unhealthy communication. So when she saw the response from her husband, she realized that there needed to be more than just showing that there was an imbalance. There needed to be a systematic way to improve the mental load. So she consolidated her spreadsheet and created a card game called Fair Play, where couples each hold domestic task cards representing all that it takes to run a home and family. So Ivrotsky considers fair play an important revolutionary moment, and she doesn't want anyone to have to spend money in order to get the benefits of playing the game. So she has a list of the cards on her website. So if you feel like that's useful but don't want to buy the card, you can also access it there. But I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the instructions of her card game. She says to sit with your partner for an hour when you are relaxed and feeling good. And if you think about our last workshop, that makes a lot of sense. We are going to be much better at communication if we're approaching it with a softened startup and aren't emotionally emotionally flooded, etc. So lay out all the task cards, choose the ones that apply to your family, and then take turns deciding which tasks you'll own completely. So own completely is really important. It means that each step that we talked about earlier, the conception, planning, and execution, is the responsibility of that card holder. That doesn't mean that if your partner picks extracurricular activities, that all he or she does is take them to the game. That means they oversee registration, coordinating carpool, having the bags ready, being the parent on the email for the coach, etc. They have complete ownership of that card. And I'd also like to say too that it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be the one driving or have to be the one doing those things. They can delegate it to that child, or they can delegate it another way, but they are in charge of making sure it's being executed, whether or not they're the ones doing it. And then finally, manage your cards for a week and then return to the table for regular check-ins. Now, in an ideal world, our partners would be totally on board, but we're all resistant to change. And this could be a really big change for our partners to divide how things have always been assumed to be divided. In fact, Ivrotsky gives these disclaimers for couples to consider before they play the game. First is that all time is created equal. We only have 24 hours in a day, so energy spent working in service to the home is as valuable as any other kind of work, and not to keep score. You might not end up dividing cards 50-50, and that's fine. Some cards simply require more time. Someone might prefer doing it. And if you're collaborative and keep the conversation open, each of you can feel like you're meeting the needs of the home and that you don't feel resentful that you're taking on more than what's fair in your family situation. Now, this is interesting to me. The book Fair Play came out in 2019, but the card game came out in 2020. That year-long pause between book and game was intentional. While the game itself is designed to help couples apply the concepts and principles, she believed that having the education and conversations about mental load first was essential. So if you feel like you're in a position in your relationship where you could just jump into the card game, go for it. But recognize that this is a process. Ivrotsky compared it to the ongoing need to exercise. You can't exercise once and say that you're fit for life. It takes effort. Managing the mental load takes frequent communication. So we're going to run through an exercise of how you could use Fair Play to get these types of conversations going. So here are just 21 of the 100 cards in the Fair Play card game. There's bathing and grooming kids, spirituality, marriage and romance, groceries, etc. So an exercise Ivrotsky suggests for getting started is to lead with curiosity. Pick one card and explore what that task looked like for you growing up. She gave an example of doing this with her husband. He was responsible for the garbage card, and she was annoyed that he wasn't taking it out as frequently as she thought he should. So they talked about what trash looked like growing up. Eve was raised by a single mom who worked all the time, and their apartment usually wasn't very well taken care of. She said that at night she would turn on the light and close her eyes while cockroaches scurried into the shadows of the kitchen. Then she'd quickly grab the trash and throw it away. So having garbage piling around her home now brings her back to that insecurity and that frustration. Now, her husband Seth talked about how he spent his college years at a frat house, sleeping with pizza boxes at his head, and that he really didn't even notice trash piling up. This exercise helped them to see where their conflict was arising, why Eve got so annoyed about garbage, whereas it wasn't even a big deal to Seth at all. Together, they were able to come up with what is coined a reasonable standard of care. What does it look like to have that task completed? For them, they decided that after dinner every night, Seth would take out the trash, and that was their reasonable standard of care. Now, there can be some skepticism. Do you really need to sit and talk about your childhood to figure out how garbage should be taken out? Ivrotsky says yes, because it's worth it. In a podcast conversation, she said, if you get somebody to take over dishes for you now, the onboarding of that might take, let's say, 5 hours of conversation, minimum standard of care negotiations, telling your story. Say you invest that 5 hours now. In the future, statistically, we're doing thousands of hours of dishes. We don't always give value to time we're saving in the future. In the case of mental load, these conversations have the potential to take a huge load off of you and save time. So we could talk about this for a long time, but for tonight's purpose, I hope you're feeling more comfortable with recognizing your mental load tasks and how each task includes the 3 steps of conception, planning, and execution. So to recap the last couple of slides, this is what Havertz recommends that you do to get this type of conversation going. First is you pick one card or mental load task. Maybe you would do one that's especially helpful to resolve, or maybe one that seems like it could be an easy win. Then you lead with curiosity. How was that card or task handled in their home growing up? And if you're at a point where one of you feels like you can take that card with ownership, you decide upon a reasonable standard of care. So when we discussed the fair play card game, the first step was really important. It was to sit with your partner for an hour when you're relaxed and feeling good. Now, maybe you aren't up to having an hour-long conversation yet, but making sure you're having these conversations when you're feeling good is crucial. We don't want to get in a place where we're emotionally flooded. Havertz says the point is to have high cognition, low emotion conversations. Timing of conversations is important, which is how weekly check-ins, which is our final topic for the evening, is going to come into play. So before we move on, I want to check in. How are you guys doing? Are there any questions or comments or concerns before we move on to our last part?
I just am fascinated by all this. It just makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I have some friends who have played fair play before, and so it's fun to see you talk about the science behind it and more of the details of the book that it's based on, and how much mental load there is behind each of those things that might not seem like a very big thing, but like your example with the trash definitely can be triggering and emotional for different people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things as I've been learning about this that was really helpful for me was the reasonable standard of care. Because if I say, I'm going to be gone, I want you to put kids to bed, there's a lot that entails. Like to me, that means like dinner's put away, dishes are in the dishwasher, kids are in their bed. Like there's a bunch of things, but for them, maybe it's the kids are in bed and I didn't think of the kitchen. So it's really helpful to have these conversations so that you can communicate and not have that almost that resentment that things aren't done the way that you would want them done, to be really clear about it. All right. Ooh, I skipped one. Okay, for our final part, we're going to talk about weekly check-ins. So these are intentional conversations that help you stay connected to your partner and make space for the most important things in your relationship. And a lot of professionals call them a lot of different things. Weekly check-ins, the Gottmans refer to them as State of the Union meetings, and others call them marriage meetings. But for our workshop, I'll just call them weekly check-ins. So there's a podcast I listened to with Dr. Tracy Dalgaish and her husband, Greg, about relationship check-ins. And he said something that I think is worth noting. He said, maybe the moniker of meeting is almost a hang-up. It's too formal, too to-do list. So how do you feel right now about the thought of a weekly check-in? So take a moment to write or think about your initial reaction. Maybe that's something you're already doing. Maybe you're like, I can't add one more thing to my to-do list. Or maybe you feel like you'd be on board, but your partner might not be on board. So I'll give you like 20 seconds to think about that. I lost track of the clock, but we'll keep going. So I'm going to show you 2 templates that you could follow for a weekly check-in. And in the reference sheet, I'll send you, there's an article that outlines the template, so you don't need to worry about remembering everything you see. It's just kind of getting a feel for what these could look like. So the first template is what the Gottmans have created, and it includes 4 steps. The first is to take turns sharing 5 things your partner did in the past week that you appreciated. Next, you talk about something that went well in the relationship. Maybe you had a really stressful week and you recognize that you both handled that stress better than you would have in the past. Or you went on a date that was a needed break. You're noticing the good. And something I love that Ralphie Jacobs says is when you focus on the good gets better. Third, you take turns sharing a concern from the past week. So if you remember our workshop from last time, that conflict can be connecting. This is a time to talk about mental load, maybe picking one card to talk about that could fit in at this step. And then finally, you end by sharing one thing your partner could do to help you feel more connected to them in the following week. Excuse me. The next one is a slightly revised version of the Gottmans, designed by Nate Bagley, who's a relationship expert. And this one has 5 steps. The first is to start with gratitude. That's the same as the Gottmans. What do you appreciate about your partner? The next is celebrate your wins both inside and outside of the relationship. Maybe you met a big deadline or you implemented self-care better this week because you want to be each other's biggest cheerleaders. The third is logistics can be tedious, but talking through the upcoming week can be really helpful in being proactive about what's coming up. This is a time to review calendars, plan your date, or other goals that you want to discuss. The fourth is to discuss how to improve your marriage. And it's important that you're in a, like we said earlier, in a low emotion, high cognition state. So if you're in a good spot emotionally, you can focus on things like the mental load or other things that might have come up in your relationship. And then the final step is to end your meeting with affection, whether it's a hug, a kiss, or cuddling. He recommends that you do this to help transition out from being more of a business-like partner to being lovers and friends again. So again, I want to emphasize that these don't need to be prescriptive. Your weekly check-ins don't have to look exactly like either of those templates. However, a few recurring themes include expressing gratitude, noting what's working for you, and taking time to improve something. But you can make it work for you. So here's a few things to think about when implementing a weekly check-in. First is maybe, is there anything that stood out to you in the templates that might be helpful? Think about how you feel in your relationship right now. If you feel like you're frequently in conflict, it might be best to simply add a weekly check-in where you only express appreciation and note something worth celebrating that week. You could do that even for several months until you're in a place where you feel like you can talk about the mental load or other areas with that high cognition and low emotion. Next is, how much time do you have? In certain seasons, adding an hour meeting every week might be so overwhelming that it won't happen. So do you have any window where you could do it even just for a few minutes? And finally, and most importantly, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Greg Stewart in the podcast about weekly check-ins said, I think most of us can scratch together 5 minutes. It's not all or nothing. It's showing up with a lot of flexibility and openness. I think it's just being consistent in doing it. And for our final activity, I'd love for you to write down what your next step regarding weekly check-ins could look like. Maybe you're already doing it, but you want to incorporate talking about a mental load task, or maybe just talking or thinking about the concept of weekly check-ins with your partner would be helpful. Or reading a couple of blogs about how people have implemented weekly check-ins. There's a lot of ways, there's no right or wrong of how to start thinking or acting on this. So go ahead and take a minute to reflect on that. We're done. So thank you for your time in coming tonight. I hope you feel more comfortable explaining the mental load and the CPE, break down the conception, planning, and execution. Have identified some of your unique elements of your mental load and feel like you have some tools to talk about it with your partner and a next step in mind for your weekly check-in. So just like our last workshop, I'll send you an application assignment. The first section is to write out some pain points in your mental load and then pick one and break it down into that conception, planning, and execution. The second is to pick out one of the fair play cards that you could talk about with your partner. And I'll be emailing you a list that you could pick from. And then you can pick one to talk about with your partner and then write down what you've learned. And then finally, brainstorm a few things that could work, a few times that could work to do a weekly check-in, and then try implementing it. Again, a 5-minute check-in with just gratitude absolutely counts. And then record what you learned. Maybe it went well, maybe it was a total flop, it needs to be reworked, but just try something. So again, thank you. Look for the email tomorrow with the application assignment and resources from the material. The mental load is an especially deep topic. And if there's anything I can go in deeper with you, let me know and I would be happy to keep talking. So thanks for trusting me with your time, and I'm grateful to have been with you.